Welcome to a deep dive into the heart of Army doctrine. We're tackling ADP 307 today,
Okay.
and we're going to get a grip on how the Army sees stability operations. It's one thing to read doctrine,
Right.
but it's a whole other thing to really internalize it.
Absolutely.
So buckle up, everybody, because we're about to get into the weeds on why this document, ADP 307, is so crucial for any soldier, no matter their role.
You hit the nail on the head. It's easy to think of offense and defense as the main event, but ADP 307 really flips the script.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. What specifically caught your eye about how ADP 307 approaches stability operations?
Well, it straight up says stability operations are interwoven into everything.
Oh,
It's not just about securing the peace after a fight. It's about setting the stage for lasting stability before a conflict even arises. We're talking about supporting civil control, rebuilding essential services, like even boosting a nation's economy. It's about creating the conditions where peace can take root and actually last.
so it's about a lot more than just handing out aid after a big battle.
Way more. Think of it like this. You're not just winning a war. You're trying to win hearts and minds. You're trying to build a future where conflict isn't the default setting. And that takes a different kind of strategy, one that starts long before the first shot is ever fired and continues long after the last one fades away.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does this document, ADP 307, how does it lay out the Army's role in all of this?
Well, it starts by placing stability operations within the broader context of what the Army calls unified land operations.
Which essentially means?
It means recognizing that the Army doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? It's always part of a larger effort, working alongside other branches of the military, government agencies, NGOs, international partners, you name it. It's about understanding that true stability requires a coordinated effort across all these different players.
And where do stability operations fit into this unified land operations framework?
ADP 307 highlights 4 elements happening at the same time: offense, defense, stability, and defense support of civil authorities, or DSCA.
Oh.
No single element trumps the other. They work together, but the emphasis shifts depending on what the situation calls for.
So even in the heat of battle, there's an understanding that long-term peace requires more than just a military victory.
Precisely. You have to be laying the groundwork for a future where people aren't just going to turn around and start fighting over the same issues again and again.
Which brings us to the Army's 4 strategic roles in all of this, right?
Right.
Shaping,
Yep.
preventing,
Uh-huh.
conducting large-scale combat operations,
Yes.
and consolidating gains. And I'm guessing each of these plays a role in achieving stability, but in different ways.
Exactly. So shaping is about proactively building relationships, addressing the root causes of instability, deterring adversaries. Essentially, it's setting the stage for long-term stability. Then you have preventing, which is about, well, taking action to stop conflict before it even has a chance to begin. And then, of course, you have conducting large-scale combat operations, which is, what most people probably picture when they think of the Army.
Right.
But then what's interesting is that even after a huge combat operation, ADP 307 hammers home the point that consolidating gains is not a one-and-done deal.
So it's about more than just, declaring victory and heading home.
Way more. Think of it like building a house, right?
Okay.
You can win a battle and end up with just a pile of rubble. That doesn't mean you have a functioning society.
Right.
Consolidating gains is about building those institutions, that infrastructure.
Yeah.
You're creating a place where people feel safe and can actually start to put their lives back together. It's about making sure that any of those victories achieved through combat actually stick. And that means transitioning security to local forces, rebuilding infrastructure, helping to set up a functioning government, and adjust society, basically, all the things we've been talking about.
Right.
It's a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly complex, especially when you start to think about all the moving parts, all the different players involved. So how do military leaders even begin to plan for something this intricate?
Well, they have a really useful tool, and ADP 307 points directly to it. It's called the Essential Stability Task Matrix,
Okay.
and it was developed by the Department of State.
And what's the gist of this matrix?
Think of it as a really, really detailed checklist of all the tasks that are essential for stabilizing and rebuilding a nation, almost like a playbook for how to create lasting peace. Now, it's important to remember that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
Every situation is going to be unique, but it's a starting point for planning, a way to make sure you're thinking about all the key elements.
Okay, that makes more sense. So what kind of things are on this checklist? Just give me the broad strokes.
It's broken down into 5 main sectors: security, justice and reconciliation, humanitarian assistance and social well-being, governance and participation, and economic stabilization and infrastructure. And within each of those sectors, there are, specific tasks and even subtasks that need to be considered.
Wow, that's a pretty broad range of issues.
Yeah.
So where does the Army's specific responsibility lie within those sectors? I mean, we are talking about ADP 307 here, so I'm guessing it's not just about combat operations.
You're right on the money. ADP 307, it outlines 6 key tasks for the Army: establish civil security, support civil control, restore essential services, support governance, support economic and infrastructure development, and conduct security cooperation.
Okay.
And these are the Army's, how do I put it? These are the Army's primary avenues, the ways that they can contribute to lasting stability.
Okay, so those 6 tasks are kind of like the Army's piece of the puzzle, but I have a feeling it gets even more granular than that, right? I mean, what do these tasks actually look like on the ground?
You're right, it does get more granular. Each of those 6 key tasks has a whole bunch of subtasks that fall underneath it. Think of it like this. The 6 tasks are the chapters, and the subtasks are the paragraphs where you get into the real nitty-gritty details.
Okay, so let's get specific then. Can you give me an example of what one of those subtasks might look like in the real world?
Absolutely. Let's take establish civil security as an example.
Okay.
One subtask under that category might be, let's say, helping to disarm and demobilize former combatants after a conflict has ended.
So it's about a lot more than just, traditional security measures like patrols and checkpoints.
Right. It's about addressing the root causes of instability, about preventing future conflict. This specific subtask, it could involve things like providing vocational training to former fighters, offering psychological support to help them cope with trauma, and creating programs to help reintegrate them back into civilian life.
It sounds like it's a much more holistic approach to security, recognizing that lasting peace really requires addressing these underlying social and economic factors that can often drive conflict in the first place.
You got it. And if we look at another key task like, let's say, support to economic and infrastructure development, a subtask under that could be anything from assessing the condition of roads and bridges after, say, a natural disaster, to even something like helping to set up a microloan program to support local businesses.
I see. So these subtasks are all about taking those broad goals, like establishing security or supporting economic development, and translating them into concrete actions.
Hmm.
It's one thing to say, we want to rebuild this nation.
Right.
It's another thing entirely to actually go out and make it happen.
Exactly. And that's where the real work comes in, because every single situation is different.
Yeah.
You have to be able to adapt your approach using the tools and resources you have available to meet the specific challenges of each unique environment.
And that's got to be one of the biggest challenges of stability operations, figuring out how to adapt to each unique context, right? I mean, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, no magic formula.
You're exactly right. And that's why ADP 307 stresses the importance of cultural awareness, of really understanding the local context.
And what does that really mean?
I mean, you have to be willing to learn about the history, the politics, the social dynamics of the people you are working with, even their religious beliefs. It's not just about having military strength. It's about using that strength in a way that's sensitive and actually effective.
It almost sounds like, in many ways, cultural understanding is just as important as military strength in these situations.
Oh, it's absolutely critical because, honestly, if you don't understand the local culture, if you don't at least try to respect their local customs and traditions, you risk alienating the very people you're there to try to help.
Of course.
And that can completely undermine the entire mission.
So how does ADP 307 define winning when it comes to stability operations? Because it sounds like it's about a lot more than just, a military victory in the battlefield.
You're right on the mark. ADP 307 defines winning as achieving the overall political objectives of the mission.
Which usually means?
Creating a stable, self-sufficient nation that doesn't pose a threat to the U.S. or its allies. You're trying to get at the root causes of instability, build up local capacity, and create the conditions for lasting peace, not just a break in the fighting.
It's a long game, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Which let's be honest, is much harder than simply achieving a military victory.
It absolutely is. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes a deep understanding of, all the different factors that contribute to instability, but it's the only way to achieve truly lasting peace.
It sounds like ADP 307 is really trying to instill a more nuanced view of conflict and what it takes to truly create lasting peace.
It is, and that's why it's such an essential document for every soldier, no matter their rank or their MOS. It provides a framework for understanding the bigger picture, and it helps them to see how their individual actions can actually contribute to that larger goal.
Wow. Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today. We've covered a lot of ground, but I get the feeling that there's still much more to explore.
There always is. But for now, I think it's a good place to pause and let our listeners kind of digest everything we've discussed so far.
Really?
Because transitioning from the pages of doctrine to actually having boots on the ground, that's where things get really interesting.
That's the perfect cliffhanger. For our listeners, make sure to join us for part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into the real-world implications of ADP 307 and really tackle the challenges of putting these ideas into action.
That's exactly right. Going from doctrine to boots on the ground, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Because it's one thing to have a plan on paper, but putting that plan into action in a complex, ever-changing environment like a stability operation,
Right.
that's got to be one of the biggest challenges.
It definitely is. And that's why, ADP 307 doesn't just throw a checklist at commanders and say, good luck, figure it out.
Right.
It recognizes that successful stability operations really require, a deep understanding of the operational environment.
So it's not just about what you do, it's about understanding where you are,
Yes,
who you're working with, and what makes that specific context unique.
exactly. It means taking the time to really analyze the situation. And I don't just mean from a military perspective.
What do you mean?
Well, you have to look at the political landscape.
Right.
Who are the power brokers? What are the underlying tensions that might be bubbling below the surface?
Okay.
You have to consider the cultural norms, the economic conditions, even the historical grievances that might be fueling some of this instability.
Right.
It's about really getting at the root causes of the conflict, not just the symptoms.
So it's about more than just identifying who all the players are.
Right.
It's about understanding, what motivates them, what their goals are, maybe even, what their fears are.
Exactly. And just like a doctor has to be able to adapt their approach based on each patient.
Right.
Military leaders can't just use a cookie-cutter approach to stability operations. What works in one context might completely backfire in another.
Okay, so understanding the operational environment is obviously crucial,
Yeah.
but that's just one piece of the puzzle.
Hmm.
What are some of the other key challenges that military leaders have to grapple with when it comes to actually implementing the ideas that are outlined in ADP 307?
One of the biggest ones is building those relationships and coordinating with all the different players involved in a stability operation.
Right, because you're talking about working with other government agencies, international organizations, NGOs, local leaders. I mean, that's a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
That's one way to put it. Because each of these organizations, they've got their own priorities, their own culture, their own way of doing things.
Yeah.
And it's up to that military leader to somehow bring everyone together, get everyone on the same page, and get them all working toward, that same common goal.
Man, that takes some serious diplomacy skills on top of everything else.
It really does. And it requires, a deep understanding of what each of those different actors, what their roles and responsibilities are.
Right.
Who's got the resources, who's got the expertise, who has the legitimacy, the credibility within that local community. It's about understanding who brings what to the table and then finding ways to leverage those strengths.
And I imagine those roles they can shift and evolve over time too, right?
Absolutely. One of the key concepts in ADP 307 is this idea of transitioning.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that mean exactly?
Basically, it means gradually handing over responsibility for things like security and governance to those local actors as they become more capable of handling it on their own.
Okay.
The end goal is to create a situation where that international presence is no longer needed, where that host nation can actually stand on its own 2 feet.
Right, that makes sense. But how do you know when the right time is to make that transition? Because I imagine that's got to be a really tough call.
It is. There's no easy answer, no magic formula. It takes constant assessment, constant reevaluation of the situation on the ground. You have to ask yourself, are local security forces capable of maintaining order? Is the government actually functioning the way it's supposed to? Are those essential services being provided to the population?
Right, right.
These are the questions that those military leaders, they have to be asking themselves constantly.
And it's not just about checking boxes, right?
Yeah.
It's about making sure that those institutions, they're legitimate and that they're actually sustainable for the long haul.
You got it. Because here's the thing. If you transition too early, you run the risk of seeing everything you've worked for just completely unravel, right?
Right.
But if you wait too long, then you can actually create a situation of dependency and actually hinder the development of that local capacity.
Right. So it's a very delicate balancing act. It requires a lot of judgment on the part of those military leaders that are on the ground
Yeah.
making those tough calls.
It does, and it really highlights another crucial aspect of ADP 307, and that is that emphasis on legitimacy.
Okay.
Because it doesn't matter how much military force you might have at your disposal, if you don't have the support of the people of that local population,
Right.
you're not going to achieve lasting stability. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like that old saying,
Yeah.
you can win the battle but lose the war.
Exactly. Because in stability operations, you're not just trying to defeat an enemy on the battlefield. You're trying to win over hearts and minds.
Yeah.
And that requires, a different approach, one that prioritizes building those relationships, cultural sensitivity, and a real genuine respect for local norms and values.
So how do you do that? How do you actually build trust and legitimacy in a place, in an environment where there might be, a long history of mistrust or even animosity towards, any kind of foreign forces?
Well, it's not easy, that's for sure. It takes time, it takes patience, and a willingness to listen and learn from the local community. You have to show through your actions that you're there to help, not to occupy or control.
Right. You have to back up your words with deeds.
Exactly. It's about building those genuine relationships, understanding the needs and concerns of the people you are working with and for, and then working collaboratively to try to find solutions.
Okay.
It's not about imposing your will. It's about empowering local communities to really step up and take ownership of their own future.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of understanding the operational environment, building relationships, transitioning responsibility, and maintaining legitimacy.
Right.
Are there any other, I don't know, any other major challenges that come to mind when it comes to actually putting ADP 307 into practice in the real world?
Well, one that we can't ignore is the issue of resources.
Okay.
Because even with the best plans in the world and the most skilled and experienced leadership, stability operations, they are incredibly resource-intensive endeavors.
So talking about funding,
Yep.
personnel, equipment, I mean, all the things that you need
Oh, yeah.
to make these types of operations work.
Exactly. And it's not just about having enough resources. It's about using them in a smart way, in an efficient way.
Right.
Because those resources, they're often limited, especially when you're dealing with these protracted conflicts or, these really difficult post-disaster situations.
And I imagine there's a lot of competition for those resources too.
Absolutely. You've got all these competing priorities, right? You've got humanitarian needs, you've got all these reconstruction efforts, you have economic development programs, and they're all vying for that same pot of money.
Right, right.
And that's where those really difficult strategic decisions come in. You have to be able to weigh the costs and benefits of each option and then make those really difficult choices about where to allocate those resources for, to get maximum impact.
And I imagine those decisions are often made with, under a lot of pressure, with a lot of uncertainty. You don't always have all the information you would want to make a fully informed decision.
You're absolutely right. Predicting the long-term effects of any action, especially when you're talking about a complex and fluid environment like that,
Right.
it's really difficult. But, that's the nature of this beast. That's
Yeah.
stability operations. It's about navigating ambiguity, managing risk, and constantly adapting to the changing circumstances on the ground.
So it sounds like ADP 307, it provides a framework,
Yeah,
it provides a foundation, but it doesn't necessarily give you all the answers.
precisely. It's a guide, but it's not a blueprint.
Right.
It gives commanders and their teams the tools to think critically about the challenges of stability operations, to make those informed decisions, especially in these really complex and really fluid environments. But the real test is how they apply those tools once they're out there in the real world, how they adapt and adjust their approach based on the unique circumstances that they are facing on the ground.
Right, which brings us back to training and preparation. Because if you're a soldier and you're deploying to a stability operation,
Right.
you need to be prepared for those very unique and specific challenges.
Absolutely. And that preparation goes beyond just traditional combat skills, too, right? It's
Correct.
about developing cultural awareness, honing your communication skills, conflict resolution, all of those things that are absolutely essential for operating effectively in what is ultimately a very complex human environment.
So it's about seeing yourself as more than just a soldier at that point, right?
Yeah,
You're a diplomat, a
right.
mediator, even a builder at times.
Precisely. And honestly, that's what makes stability operations so challenging, but also so rewarding. Because you're not just fighting an enemy, you're fighting for something much bigger than yourself. You're fighting for peace, for stability, for a better future.
It's about making a very real difference in the lives of people who are really struggling.
Exactly. And that requires a very different kind of courage. It's not just physical courage, it's moral courage, it's intellectual courage. It's the courage to embrace complexity and uncertainty and to just keep moving forward, even when the way ahead is murky at best.
Because in stability operations, the mission is rarely black and white.
Right.
There's rarely a clear finish line.
Exactly. And that's why it's all the more important to have a really solid understanding of those principles outlined in ADP 307. Because those principles, they're like a compass. They're a guide for navigating the really gray, really murky complexities of these types of operations and making decisions that are truly in the best interest of the people that you are there to help.
Okay, I think that's a great place for us to transition to part 3 of this deep dive. We've talked a lot about, the what and the how of ADP 307.
We have.
But now I want to kind of bring it all home for those listening, because at the end of the day, ADP 307 isn't just some, abstract document, right?
Hmm.
It's meant to guide the actions of every soldier, every leader who was operating in these very complex and challenging environments all around the world.
It is.
So for all those soldiers listening out there, what are some of those key takeaways that you should carry with you when you're out in the field? What are the things that are really going to make a difference on the ground?
I'm glad you asked because honestly, understanding the why behind the what is what makes all the difference when it comes to taking those ideas from the page and putting them into practice.
Yep.
But I think that is a conversation best saved for part 3.
So you left us hanging there at the end of part 2.
I did, didn't I?
You said there's a lot to unpack about how to take this doctrine and put it into practice.
Yeah.
So let's pick up right where we left off. We've spent the last 2 parts of this deep dive really exploring the ins and outs of stability operations and why they matter so much.
We've covered a ton of ground from those big picture concepts to, like you said, to the really practical nitty-gritty challenges of actually putting these ideas into action out there in the real world.
Right. Because at the end of the day, this document, this
Yeah.
doctrine, it's not just theoretical.
No, not at all.
It's meant to guide the actions of every soldier, every leader
Yeah.
who's operating these really complex environments that we've been talking about.
Exactly. And that's honestly what I think gets lost sometimes, in all the jargon and the theory of military doctrine.
What do you mean?
Well, we can't ever forget that human element, right?
Okay, I like where you're going with this. So for all the soldiers listening out there, what are some of the key takeaways from ADP 307 that they should really carry with them, out in the field? What are the things that are really going to make a difference, on the ground?
For me, the most important takeaway is remembering that you are part of something so much bigger than just yourself, bigger than your unit even.
Okay.
You're not just a soldier, you're a diplomat, you're a mediator, a builder at times. You are an ambassador for the United States, whether you realize it or not. And the things you do and the things that you say, every action you take, big or small, they can shape perceptions, build trust, or completely destroy it.
So it's about really understanding the weight and the responsibility that comes with wearing that uniform.
Exactly. It means taking the time to understand that cultural context,
Yeah.
treating everyone you encounter with respect, and just, being mindful, being aware of the impact that your words and your actions might have on the people around you, on that local community.
Because, let's face it, in a stability operation, even the small things, a gesture of kindness, a willingness to listen, those things can have a ripple effect.
Oh, absolutely. And at the same time, just one careless word, one disrespectful action can damage those relationships and set back progress so quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's about really recognizing that at the end of the day, you're not just operating in a military context, you're operating in a human one.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to another one of those key takeaways from ADP 307 that we talked about. The importance of really effective communication.
And I don't just mean being able to speak the language, although that obviously helps.
Right. It goes way beyond that. It's about being able to clearly communicate your intent, understand where other people are coming from, even when their perspective is vastly different from your own. And then, it's about how do you build those bridges across cultural divides.
It's about, it's about active listening. It's about asking questions. It's about being open to those different points of view, even when it's hard.
Oh, for sure. And don't forget about nonverbal communication too, right?
Yeah.
Your body language, your tone of voice, even, something as small as a facial expression. These things all matter, especially in those really high stakes situations where trust can be pretty fragile.
In those situations, your actions really do speak louder than words.
100%. Which leads me to another really crucial skill that I think every soldier should take away from this document, from ADP 307, the ability to adapt, to be resourceful.
Okay.
Because, let's be honest, in a stability operation, no 2 days are the same.
Rarely do things go according to plan, I'm guessing.
Rarely is an understatement. Plans change. Unexpected problems pop up constantly. You have to be able to think on your feet, be creative, figure out how to come up with solutions using whatever resources you have at your disposal.
Right.
It's about getting comfortable with that uncertainty, with ambiguity. You have to accept that sometimes the best laid plan is going to go completely sideways.
And when that happens, you can't get stuck in the mud, you know? You have to adapt, learn from those inevitable mistakes, and keep moving forward.
You got it. It takes a certain mindset, a willingness to kind of roll with the punches. You have to be flexible, be a problem solver. Those are the qualities that really make a soldier effective in a stability operation.
So to wrap this up, I think what we keep coming back to is that ADP 307 is really about giving soldiers the tools to navigate these gray areas of conflict, right?
It is.
Those places where, the mission isn't always perfectly clear, where success isn't just about, miles on a map or how many of the enemy you've eliminated.
It's not that simple.
It's about building those relationships. And honestly, it's about touching lives and making things better.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about giving soldiers, especially leaders, that mindset, that skill set that they need to operate effectively in a complex, constantly changing, and, let's be honest, deeply, deeply human environment.
It's about recognizing that true peace, lasting peace, the kind that actually takes root and grows, that requires a different approach. It takes more than just military strength.
Absolutely.
It requires compassion, empathy, and a real commitment
Yeah.
to working hand in hand with those local communities to build that better future.
Well said. And honestly, that is a mission that every soldier, every leader should be incredibly proud to be a part of.
Couldn't agree more. Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive, but I really do hope that I hope this conversation has sparked some new insights or maybe even challenged a few assumptions.
And hopefully it's inspired you to keep learning, to keep asking those tough questions and to
Okay.
keep diving deep into the things that matter. Because in this line of work, let's be honest, the learning never stops.
That's right. Until next time, keep exploring, and thanks for joining us on the deep dive.